Welcome back to the show. This is episode 720 of Conflicts of Interest, and today is December 2nd, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of news to get through on today's show, but first I want to plug the brand new Kyle Anzalone show and recommend that you all head on over to YouTube and subscribe to the new channel. There is a link. It is the first link in the show notes page, so very easy to find. If you guys want to, you could probably click on over now, just listen to this in the second tab, and head on over and just hit the subscribe button on the Kyle Anzalone Show channel. Thank you so much. That will really help me out. The Kyle Anzalone Show is my great new show. I have a production team helping me with it, so the quality is just a little bit better than what we have here at Conflicts of Interest, and it's getting better with every single episode, so you guys definitely want to check that out. Similar concepts to Conflicts of Interest, but definitely just a little bit higher quality on the production end and the video end of the product. All right, everybody, let's get into the news today. The first story we have here: White House pressing Ukraine to draft at 18-year-olds for war. So the White House is pressuring Ukraine to increase the size of its military by lowering the minimum age of conscription from 25 to 18, the Associated Press reported on Wednesday. A senior Biden administration official said the outgoing administration wants Ukraine to start drafting 18-year-olds to expand the current pool of fighting-age males. The pressure from the U.S. comes as polling shows the majority of Ukrainians want peace talks with Russia to end the war. National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan, which we previously covered on this show, recently hinted that the U.S. was pressuring Ukraine to expand encryption, saying Ukraine's biggest problem in the war was a lack of manpower. He told PBS NewsHour last week, "Our view has been that there's not one weapon system that would make a difference in this battlefield. It's about manpower, and Ukraine needs to do more, in our view, to firm up its lines in terms of the number of forces it has on the front lines." So last month, an aide to President Zelensky said Ukraine was under pressure from U.S. politicians to lower the conscription age. He said American politicians from both parties are putting pressure on Zelensky to explain why there is no mobilization for those aged 18 to 25 in Ukraine. And so Zelensky signed a mobilization bill into law back in April that lowered the conscription age from 27 to 25. A few weeks before the mobilization bill became law, Zelensky received a visit from U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, who complained that not enough young Ukrainians were being sent to the front lines. Graham said, "I would hope that those eligible to serve in the Ukrainian military would join. I can't believe it's 27. You're in a fight for your life, so you should be serving, not at 25 or 27. We need more people in the line." The Biden administration's push for Ukraine to draft younger men comes as it's doing everything it can to escalate the proxy war before President-elect Donald Trump is inaugurated on January 20th. President Biden is seeking $24 billion to spend on the conflict, even though it's clear there's no path to a Ukrainian military victory, and of course, conscripting these young men will just cost them their lives. All right, next up here. This article I wrote for the Institute on December 1st. As many as 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have deserted. So if we're wondering why they're being pressed to draft 18-year-olds, well, maybe it's because everybody else is refusing to head back to the front lines. So Ukrainian soldiers are refusing to report for duty or walking away from their frontline positions is becoming an increasing problem for Kiev. One Ukrainian lawmaker said there have been as many as 200,000 desertions. Ukrainian officials and soldiers told the AP that facing every imaginable shortage, tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops, tried and bereft, have walked away from combat and frontline positions to slide into anonymity. Entire units have abandoned their posts, leaving defensive lines vulnerable and accelerating territorial losses, according to military commanders and soldiers. Soldiers failing to report to their posts is a rapidly worsening problem for Kiev. In 2022, only 9,000 Ukrainians were prosecuted for desertion. That number increased to 24,000 in 2023, and Ukrainian government data showed that prosecutions skyrocketed to 50,000 during the first 9 months of 2024. The prosecutions do not capture the whole picture, as one Ukrainian lawmaker told the AP the number could be as high as 200,000. The growing problem is likely as a result of war fatigue. One military officer said, "It is clear that now, frankly speaking, we have already squeezed the maximum out of our people." Between casualties and desertions, Kiev is facing a massive manpower shortage. The AP noted that Kiev lost a net 4,000 soldiers along its front lines in September, and so I believe that means not just that they lost 4,000 soldiers, 4,000 people were killed, injured, walked off. That's not what it's saying. They're saying that they lost 4,000 more than they were able to add to their frontline positions, right? So they lost a net of 4,000 soldiers across their front lines. And that was just in a single month. So obviously this problem is bad and is getting worse for the Ukrainians. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Russia says Ukraine hit Kursk with U.S. ATACMS twice in recent days. This was written on November 26th, so midway through last week. Russia on Tuesday said that Ukrainian forces fired U.S.-provided Army tactical missile systems, or ATACMS, into Russia's Kursk Oblast twice in recent days and vowed there would be a response. The Russian Defense Ministry said Ukraine fired 5 ATACMS against Russian S-400 missile defense systems on November 23rd. The ministry said air defenses intercepted 3 missiles, while 2 hit their targets, resulting in damage to the radar system and the injury of several Russian troops. 2 days later, on November 25th, Ukrainian forces fired 8 ATACMS at a Russian airfield in Kursk. The ministry said 7 were intercepted, while 1 hit its target, damaging infrastructure and wounding 2 soldiers. The Russian Defense Ministry said that retaliatory actions are being prepared. Last week, Ukraine launched its first, so this is 2 weeks ago, Ukraine launched its first ATACMS strike on Russian territory, targeting the Bryansk Oblast. In a recent response to that strike, and Ukraine also firing British Storm Shadow missiles into Russia, Russia fired a new intermediate-range hypersonic missile at a military facility in Ukraine. When discussing the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow attacks, Putin said Russia had a right to strike the military facilities of the countries that are supplying such missiles to Ukraine, demonstrating the NATO-supported long-range strikes in Russia risk World War III and nuclear escalation. Putin explained, "We consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against military facilities of those countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities. If anyone doubts that they are wrong, there will always be a response." ATACMS have a range of about 190 miles, and Storm Shadows could hit targets 155 miles away. Both missiles require intelligence from Ukraine's Western backers to be fired, meaning that NATO is now directly involved in Russian territory. While the strikes risk nuclear escalation, U.S. officials have admitted the capability is not expected to alter the course of the war, and Ukraine is said to only have a limited supply of the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows. And some of the reading that I did on those attacks last week that involved the ATACMS, and so this is a little bit to explain, but I think having all these details will help you all just understand the situation a little bit more. So when we're talking about the ATACMS, there's actually 2 variants. There's an older variant and there's a newer variant. The older variant is a cluster variant that has a range of about 100 miles. And so my guess is when these are fired, they're a little bit less provocative from the Kremlin's viewpoint than when we fire the ones with the unitary warhead that have a range of about 190 miles. Well, it's unclear how many ATACMS that Ukraine has in total. The Kiev Independent did an investigation, and they said they likely only have a few dozen, if not less, of the long-range 190-mile variant of the ATACMS, and then they only have a few dozen of the other variant as well. It's pretty clear that they've used dozens of the 100-mile variant already to this point in the war. I have no idea how many they have left of either of these weapons, or, if Washington's maybe shipped them more of these covertly than have been publicly acknowledged, and so the stockpile in Kiev is a little bit higher, but certainly there is not a massive supply of these weapons, and in fact, the supply is one of the reasons that U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin initially was against transferring the ATACMS to Ukraine. He only did so after a lot of pressure. All right, next up here. Putin says Russia can hit decision-making centers in Ukraine with its new Orshnik missile. So Russian President Vladimir Putin suggested Russia could strike decision-making centers in Ukraine with its new intermediate-range hypersonic missile as a potential response to Ukraine firing U.S. and British missiles into Russian territory. So according to TASS, which is the Russian state news agency, Putin said at a meeting of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO alliance, the Defense Ministry and the General Staff of the Russian Army are currently selecting targets to strike on the territory of Ukraine. In response to two recent Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory that used U.S.-provided Army tactical missile systems, which have a range of up to 190 miles, the Russian Defense Ministry said it was preparing a retaliation. Putin said these targets may include military facilities, defense industry enterprises, or decision-making centers in Kiev. And while the obvious thought of decision-making centers in Kiev comes Ukrainian, so this would be Zelensky or his military command, but Putin may say that actually the decision-making centers in Kiev are not Ukrainian centers, but Western centers. So wherever, the Western intelligence and where we are bringing our war games intelligence to the Ukrainians and telling them, oh, they should do these tactics because, we estimate this is going to happen. Maybe he is talking about attacking those facilities rather than just the Ukrainian ones. So the Oreshnik, or the intermediate range hypersonic missile, is capable of being armed with a nuclear warhead. Russia fired an Orshnik into Ukrainian territory on November 21st in response to a U.S. ATACMS and British Storm Shadow missiles that were being fired into Russian territory. Ukrainian officials said the Oreshnik was likely not carrying any explosives since it didn't do any significant damage. Putin said on Thursday that Russia had started the serial production of the new missile. When he first announced the launch on November 21st, Putin also warned that he believes that Russia has the right to strike military facilities of countries that are supplying missiles to Ukraine that are hitting Russian territory. We consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against the military facilities of those countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities, Putin said. If anyone doubts this, then they are wrong. There will always be a response, and so it still seems like there's probably a Russian response on the way. Now, last story here about Ukraine is maybe somewhat interesting and maybe some good news. Zelensky says he's willing to cede territory in exchange for NATO protection. And so obviously he's not going to get that NATO protection, but if he really wants to cede some territory to end the war, that may be something that could be achieved. So on Friday, Ukrainian President Zelensky said he was willing to temporarily cede territory to Russia to bring an end to the war in exchange for NATO protection over Ukraine. Zelensky told Sky News, if we want to stop the hot stage of the war, we should take under the NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control. That's what we need to do fast, and then Ukraine can get back to the other part of its territorial diplomacy. Zelensky's suggestion is almost certainly a non-starter for Russia since it launched the invasion to keep Ukraine out of NATO, but it does reflect a shift in position. Zelensky previously maintained that his war goals included driving Russia out of all of Ukrainian territory that Russia had captured since February 2022, as well as the Crimean Peninsula that was annexed years ago. In a recent conversation with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Russian President Vladimir Putin pointed to a speech he made earlier this year that outlined his conditions for peace, which included Ukraine withdrawing from all of Russian territory that Russia has annexed, Ukrainian neutrality, and the lifting of all Western sanctions on Russia. Ukrainian neutrality was Russia's main demand during a short-lived negotiation that took place in the early days of the invasion. Ukrainian and Russian officials held talks in March in April of 2022, but the negotiations were discouraged by the U.S. and its allies. In an interview with Sky News, Zelensky said Ukraine wouldn't agree to a ceasefire without guarantees of NATO protection. He said, "We need NATO protection very much, otherwise Putin will come back, otherwise we are just going... How are we going to do a ceasefire? For us, it's very dangerous." And so his conditions for a ceasefire essentially prevent a ceasefire from ever taking place. All right, now moving on to the Middle East, U.S. moving forward with $680 million weapons package for Israel. So the Biden administration is moving forward with a $680 million with an M, weapons package for Israel as the U.S. continues to fuel Israel's onslaught in Gaza. The Wall Street Journal reported on Wednesday that the administration notified Congress of its intention to move ahead with an arms deal for Israel, which includes joint direct attack munitions, or J-bomb kits, and small diameter bombs. So it's unclear how the deal will be financed, but it will likely be paid for with U.S. military aid. The U.S. provides Israel with a form of military aid known as foreign military financing, which provides foreign governments with money to purchase U.S.-made weapons. Israel does actually get an exception to this, and they can buy Israeli weapons with the U.S. money, although they often buy U.S. weapons with the U.S. money. So Brown University's Cost of War Project said in a report last month that the U.S. support for Israel over the past year had cost U.S. taxpayers at least $22.76 billion. The total includes $17.9 billion in direct military aid and $4.8 billion in spending on U.S. military operations to support Israel, including the bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. So President Biden has provided Israel with more aid than any other American president in history, but the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been complaining about the pace of deliveries. Netanyahu said while announcing plans for a Lebanon ceasefire on Tuesday, "It is no secret that there have been big delays in weapons and munition deliveries. These delays will be resolved soon. We will receive the supplies of advanced weapons that will keep our soldiers safe and give us more strike force to complete our mission." And so this is something that, we haven't really talked about on the show yet, which is the ceasefire in Lebanon. We'll get to that more in a moment here. But it is interesting that when Netanyahu's announcing it, he's essentially saying, look, we needed a temporary pause so we could get more weapons. This really isn't about a real desire to have a ceasefire. All right, so next up, I want to talk about these statements from a former Israeli general and defense minister saying that Israel is carrying on ethnic cleansing in northern Gaza. So a former Israeli defense minister has said that Israel is conducting an ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza, where Israeli troops are forcibly expelling civilians under the threat of death. Moshe Yaalon, a former member of the ruling Likud party, was defense minister under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from 2013 to 2016 during the 2014 Gaza war. In comments on Saturday, he criticized the current Netanyahu government. He said, "The path they are dragging us down is to occupy, annex, and ethnically cleanse. Look at the northern strip." When asked to clarify if he meant Israel is currently conducting an ethnic cleansing or is headed in that direction, he pointed to what is happening on the ground in northern Gaza today. "There is no Bet Lehiyah. There is no Bet Hanun. There are now operating in Jabalia. They're basically cleansing the territory of Arabs." The northern cities he mentioned have been under a total siege since the very early October as a part of an ethnic cleansing campaign that's followed the outline known as the General's Plan. In those areas, Israeli troops are demolishing homes so Palestinian civilians have nowhere to return to. The former defense minister's comments sparked strong backlash in Israel, but he doubled down on Sunday. In another interview, he said that the term ethnic cleansing was accurate and said there was no other word for it. He pointed to the Israeli ministers who openly call for the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza and the establishment of Jewish settlements. The Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich recently said there may possible to cut the population in Gaza in half within 2 years, calling it voluntary emigration, though there is nothing voluntary about the displacement in Gaza that's happening today. All right, so next up, we have to talk about what's going on in Lebanon. At least 2 killed as Israel steps up attacks across southern Lebanon. So media reports are adhering to the idea that the Lebanon ceasefire continues to hold. However, there is an awful lot of firing in southern Lebanon for that to actually be true. Israel began carrying out attacks on Thursday, and those attacks have escalated significantly over the weekend. Israel's first airstrikes were against the tiny border town of Rab al-Tahirin in Lebanon's southern district. The attacks killed at least 2 people and wounded 2 others. These were the first confirmed fatalities since the ceasefire took effect on Wednesday. Israel also attacked a car in the Tyre district. This attack wounded 3, including a 7-year-old child. Another attack near Sidon wounded another. Israeli drones were also reported flying over Lebanon's capital of Beirut and its southern suburbs, though as of yet, Israel hasn't resumed attacking Beirut area since Wednesday. Israel reported it had attacked several targets along the Syria-Lebanon border Saturday, which were described as Hezbollah smuggling sites. There have been no reports of casualties from there yet, and neither Syria nor Hezbollah has commented. Indeed, Hezbollah doesn't seem to be retaliating at all, which is probably why some of the media outlets believe the ceasefire is holding. Obviously, the ceasefire was meant to stop belligerent actions across on both sides, and in that regard, it definitely isn't holding and seems very tenuous at best. Interestingly, Israel has repeatedly claimed that ceasefire violations are on Hezbollah's side, despite none of these actually involving firing on anyone or anything. The claims have centered on vehicles traveling in the south, and Israel has reiterated that it forbids Lebanese civilians from returning to their homes in southern Lebanon. The U.S.-led international efforts to broker a ceasefire, which began on Wednesday, were meant to see Hezbollah move north of the Litani River within 60 days, and Israel withdraw from Lebanon. Israel was supposed to report violations to a U.S.-led committee, which would in turn forward them to Lebanon's army to take care of the reported violations. However, this appears to have been Israel's plan, or this appears never to have been Israel's plan. Israeli commanders say they don't expect the Lebanese army to destroy Hezbollah assets, and they will do it themselves. Israeli sources also suggest that Israeli troops might remain in southern Lebanon after the 60-day deadline under certain conditions. That would be a big violation of the ceasefire too, although as military is already firing on people left and right, that's probably not an insurmountable factor to Israel. So far, there is no indication of the U.S. doing anything about maintaining the ceasefire. The U.S. is ultimately not likely to do so as Israel is doing all the firing, although it is likely to further harm U.S. international credibility. And then maybe, and kind of surprisingly, the big story over the weekend, over the Thanksgiving holiday, was the Syrian Islamist rebel attack on Aleppo. And so Jason Ditz wrote this for antiwar.com on November 30th. After 7 days of fast gains, the Syrian Islamic forces led by Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, has forced the Syrian army forces to withdraw and has taken the major northern city of Aleppo, sometimes called Syria's second city. There has been video footage of rebels outside police headquarters in Aleppo, as well as near the historic Aleppo Citadel, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the offensive began late Wednesday, with HTS fighters pushing out of the Idlib province and into the Aleppo province countryside. There was intense fighting both Thursday and Friday, with HTS backed by the Turkish rebel factions capturing scores of towns and villages. By late Friday, they arrived at the outskirts of Aleppo, and they pushed into the city itself on Saturday. Many hundreds of people have been killed, though exact figures are not available and may not be for some time. Russian and Syrian forces also launched airstrikes against targets around Aleppo. The reports are at least 20 fighters along with 16 civilians have been killed. The Syrian army is talking about launching a counteroffensive to retake Aleppo, and reinforcements are said to be en route to the area. Both main highways leading to Aleppo have been blocked, however, so the trek into the area is likely to be difficult. HTS and associated fighters appear to be in almost all neighborhoods of Aleppo now. They have taken the airport, and the Kurdish YPG fighters are prepared to try to defend Kurdish neighborhoods in the city. Thousands of ethnic Kurds reportedly fled east into Kurdish-controlled Syria in anticipation of the fight. The fall of Aleppo is hugely significant, not just because of its size. The rebels had a history of holding it in earlier parts of the Syrian civil war, and the Syrian army's capture in December 2016 was seen as a major turning point. The civil war was never really ended, though, and now the city seems to be once again in play for the rebels. But fighting in Aleppo is unlikely to end the offensive. Already it is reported that some of the rebel fighters are moving south from Aleppo province towards the city of Hama. Hama would be the second major city in the path of the offensive, and if it fell, that would open up pushes towards Homs and even the capital of Damascus. Though the Syrian army has vowed to reverse course after the recent losses, that they have issued a statement trying to blame Israel for the HTS push. The statement insisted the army was effectively fighting the military of the Israeli enemy, falsely labeled the Syrian Revolution. They added that HTS was backed by thousands of foreign militants and had heavy weapons and drones. They reportedly got the drones from Ukraine. The statement concluded with the declaration, "You are either the Syrian Arab army or with Israel." The Syrian army isn't the only one pointing the finger at Israel. The Syrian foreign minister said on Friday that HTS offensive served the interests of the Israeli occupation forces. He mentioned the obvious connection between Israeli strikes on Syria and the rebel push. He's not the only one making the connection. Former U.S. Ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, pointed to the recent Israeli strikes on Syria as well as its war against Hezbollah as providing HTS with the opportunity to advance. Other than Israel, the Kurdish YPG is pointing the finger at Turkey, saying that it was behind HTS's offensive. Indeed, Turkish-backed rebels have participated heavily in the offensive on multiple fronts. And so I think this is a good time for me to kind of get into my thoughts on this, which is everybody is right that the Ukrainians are involved in some respect and that they see anything that diverts Russia's attention from Ukraine as a positive. I think at the very least, we could look at the constant Israeli strikes against targets in Syria, including one of the largest, maybe ever, the one on Palmyra that killed about 100 people in recent days, as all being things that give an advantage and an edge to HTS. And Turkey is obviously also involved too here. They want a large swath of northern Syria, and they've already taken a part of it from their Kurds, and this could be a part of their plan to take more of it from the Syrian army. So I think all three of those instincts are correct. The one piece I would add, and maybe the one factor that isn't talked about a lot, is I don't think that the situation in Syria could be looked at in a vacuum. And if we also look at what's happening in Georgia, I suspect, and I strongly suspect here, that the CIA, after the election of President Donald Trump, went to Biden and they said, or Blinken, Sullivan, whoever is speaking for the president that day. And they said, listen, what we need to do here is we need to, all these operations that we planned, we got on the back burner, Syria, Ukraine, we need to execute them now, or Donald Trump will never let us do it. They'll pull the plug. Now, the last thing I'll mention here is there are some reports that the leader of HTS, that's al-Jolani, he's an al-Qaeda guy, that he may have been killed in a Russian airstrike in Idlib. We will see what happens from there. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more shows, probably an episode of Kyle Anzalone, our Conflicts of Interest tomorrow. We'll have Kyle Anzalone's show on Wednesday. That's what I think the next couple days are going to look like. Again, thank you all so much for tuning in.